How a nuclear war would unfold if Russia decides to use nuclear weapons against NATO or Ukraine. Disclaimer. The following content is a hypothetical exploration of how a nuclear war between Russia, NATO, and Ukraine could potentially unfold. It is not based on real-world intelligence or predictions, but serves the purpose of exploring theoretical scenarios and their possible outcomes. Imagine this. A flash of light blazes across the horizon as a missile launches from a Russian base deep within its territory. Moments later, the world is rocked by the unthinkable, the first nuclear strike of the 21st century. The strike is aimed at a military target in Ukraine or NATO territory, and the world holds its breath, unsure of what will happen next. How would this escalate? What would be the immediate aftermath? And most importantly, how would the global conflict unfold as nuclear weapons enter the equation? The strategic calculation, a delicate balance of power. Nuclear weapons, in theory, are the ultimate deterrent, tools that ensure no one would dare start a nuclear conflict due to the catastrophic consequences for all involved. But what happens when one party, like Russia, decides that the stakes have become too high, and nuclear war is the only way to secure its national interest or deter an adversary? This is the reality that NATO and the world must face. For decades, nuclear weapons have been largely regarded as a final resort, something no rational actor would employ unless absolutely cornered. However, the use of tactical nuclear weapons in the conflict in Ukraine or against NATO would signal a complete breakdown in diplomatic efforts, a desperate push to achieve military advantage by an isolated power. In the case of Russia, its nuclear doctrine allows for the use of nuclear weapons, including tactical nuclear devices, under specific circumstances, such as when the nation faces a strategic defeat or an existential threat. Given the deepening involvement of NATO in the conflict with Ukraine, it is plausible to imagine that Russia, feeling cornered, could choose to employ nuclear weapons to shift the military balance and force a ceasefire or negotiation. The first strike. Where will it land? In the theoretical scenario, Russia's first nuclear strike could be carefully targeted to send a message, something smaller in scope that avoids immediately triggering a world-ending exchange, but is powerful enough to break the resolve of NATO and Ukraine. Hypothesis 1. A tactical strike on Ukrainian military infrastructure. One likely target could be a large Ukrainian military installation, such as a command center, airfield, or logistics base in eastern Ukraine. The use of a low-yield tactical nuclear weapon could cause widespread destruction and panic, signaling to Ukraine and NATO that Russia is willing to cross the nuclear threshold. The immediate outcome would be catastrophic for the region. The strike would likely result in massive casualties, but the true horror would not just lie in the loss of life. It would be the beginning of a total breakdown of diplomacy and the initiation of a full-scale military response from NATO. The alliance, bound by Article 5, would be under enormous pressure to retaliate to preserve its credibility and deter further escalation. Hypothesis 2. A nuclear strike on NATO territory. If Russia escalates further and decides to directly target NATO, it could strike at one of NATO's military bases in Poland or the Baltic states, places where NATO's presence is strong and where the alliance's defenses are concentrated. A nuclear attack in this region would instantly turn the conflict from a regional war into a global crisis, igniting NATO's collective defense obligations. This would push NATO to take immediate retaliatory action, likely through conventional means first. However, if Russia responds with another nuclear attack, NATO would be forced to retaliate with nuclear weapons of its own. The world would then be thrust into a terrifying new reality, with the nuclear genie unleashed. The escalation. Nuclear war in full bloom. Once the first nuclear strike has occurred, the battle for escalation dominance begins. Both Russia and NATO would scramble to control the escalation, each side calculating the next moves carefully, but knowing full well that the next misstep could lead to a global nuclear exchange. At first, NATO would likely respond with a combination of conventional military strikes, airstrikes, and missile attacks aimed at Russian military infrastructure. These responses would be designed to weaken Russia's military capabilities without triggering an all-out nuclear war. However, NATO's response would soon hit a tipping point. The alliance would have to decide whether to escalate with its own nuclear weapons or risk losing its deterrence. Hypothesis 3. NATO's counterstrike with strategic nuclear weapons. If Russia uses nuclear weapons again, particularly targeting NATO territory or threatening the survival of the alliance, NATO would almost certainly respond with a full-scale nuclear counterattack. The most likely weapons to be used would be intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, launched from US soil, or submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, from NATO fleets. These strikes would likely target Russia's most critical military and governmental infrastructure, including its nuclear command centers, air defense systems, and leadership bunkers. The result would be devastating, with massive casualties on both sides. The use of strategic nuclear weapons would make it clear that the world is now in a full-scale nuclear war, one that could escalate rapidly beyond control. The global fallout, beyond the battlefield. The environmental impact of a nuclear conflict between Russia and NATO would be as catastrophic as the military fallout. Even a limited nuclear exchange would trigger global consequences. The detonation of multiple nuclear warheads would inject massive amounts of soot and debris into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and cooling the planet. This nuclear winter could cause a dramatic drop in global temperatures, leading to crop failures, famine, and ecological collapse. Scientists estimate that even a modest nuclear exchange could lower global temperatures by several degrees, pushing humanity into a period of extreme climate instability. The economic fallout would also be severe. Global trade would halt, financial markets would crash, and nations would prioritize survival over commerce. The economic costs would be in the trillions of dollars, and recovery from such a disaster would take generations. The infrastructure necessary to support modern life, electric grids, transportation, food production, would be decimated, and much of the world's population would face food shortages, clean water shortages, and medical crises. On the human side, the long-term health effects of radiation would be felt for generations. Those in the blast zones would suffer from immediate burns, radiation sickness, and death, while those further away would face an increased risk of cancer and genetic mutations from radiation exposure. Cities would lay in ruin, and the global population would likely face a decade-long struggle for survival. The path forward: a world transformed. Once nuclear weapons are used, there is no going back. The chain reaction of escalation could see the collapse of not just Russia and NATO, but the entire world order as we know it. The war would likely continue as a battle, not just for military dominance, but for control over what is left of the planet. The path forward would be filled with hard decisions, desperation, and uncertainty. Nations would have to grapple with the implications of nuclear war: how to rebuild, how to protect the surviving population, and how to deal with the new geopolitical realities. The use of nuclear weapons in this conflict would mark the end of modern civilization as we know it. In this hypothetical scenario, the question is not just how it starts, but how it could end. Would there be negotiations? Would cooler heads prevail? Or would the world descend into total destruction? The consequences of Russia's decision to launch the first strike would change everything, from the future of international diplomacy to the survival of the human race. This thought experiment serves as a chilling reminder of why nuclear weapons must never be used, and why diplomacy, no matter how difficult, must always be the primary tool for resolving conflict.